Thanks very much for the opportunity to come back to Albury again and talk to you a little bit about some aspects of genetic improvement. So the organisers asked me to give a little talk to you where at the same time I pat you on the back for the good things you've done and give you a little bit of a kick up the bum for the things that you could be doing a little bit better. Actually, that's not true. That's not exactly what they said, but that's what I'm going to give you. So I need to turn the clock back. You've just heard about ageing beef for 8 weeks before it ends up on the plate of the consumer. We need to move back in time, not just to the beginning of that ageing process and not just back through the production system to when that calf was born, and not back through the production system through the father of that bull, but right back to the parents of that bull that was sold, that produced that animal, that it ended up being the steak and was aged for 8 weeks. So we need to think about the selection process. So we're talking about things that happened a generation or two earlier than the 8 weeks that it took for that RG to end up on the steak. So I have worked for 37 years at the university or various universities as an animal breeder, and my job as an animal breeder is to help people like yourself, stakeholders in an industry who manage and select animals, to improve your populations. So here, if I show you, we have a pool of selection candidates. So we've got some important trait here. Maybe this is something like carcass value, say. We have some other economically important trait here. This might be, say, costs of production. And each of these spots might represent the merit of a particular selection candidate that you could choose and allow it to become a parent of the next generation and produce sons which can be bought by a cow-calf operator to produce the kinds of animals that produce steak right through the food chain. So the challenge that people have making these kind of decisions is that they have a cloud here. You see there's a big variance from low performers to high performers for this trait and low performers to high performers to this trait. And this is not a circle, it's typically an ellipse. In this particular ellipse, I'm showing you the individuals that are high for this trait are also high for this trait. But sometimes the traits are antagonistically related. They go in the other direction. And so the challenge for the sire selector is to decide which ones of these particular individuals are you going to allow to be a parent. And depending on how you make that decision, you are going to move this population. So we know that if you take individuals from here, say, and use them as parents, the next generation, this plot will move to the right and it will move up. So over time, this cloud of selection candidates will move as a result of your selection. One thing we know you can't do is you can't very effectively change the amount of variation. But what you can do is you can change the mean. And there's not just 2 traits of importance. Commonly there's many, many more, perhaps 5 or 10 of them. So instead of it just being a 2-dimensional plot, I think of it more like of a cloud. It's some sort of a cloud. You can move the cloud. How should you move that cloud? We do know that the best way to move that cloud is when we make the selection using breeding values or estimates of breeding values, such as come from your breed plan systems. So I don't know how you do those selections. I know how we've encouraged you to do those selections. You probably don't even know exactly yourself how you do them. A lot of it is about whether you like the individual candidate, whether you like the look of it or not. But one thing that people like myself can do is we can look at the rear vision mirror and see where you've come from. And that's the best idea we have about how you are doing these particular processes. And what we would hope when we look in the rear vision mirror is that we can see you have changed your practices based on ideas that we have put across to you. So a really good idea at an Angus meeting is to talk to you about Hereford So Hereford is one of the nice examples for demonstrating what I mean by looking in the rear vision mirror. So here we have year of birth from 1975 to 2020. This is American Hereford Association data, so it was in EPDs in pounds, which is virtually the same as EBV in kilos. So this shows the genetic trend for yearling weight in the red line and the genetic trend for weaning weight direct in the blue line. And what we're looking to see is, has anything we have done in the last 45 years changed the way you make your selection? And you can see quite clearly here something happened round about 1990. And what happened about 1990 was when the development of ultrasound led to prediction of merit for carcass characteristics. So up until that time, selection was primarily on growth. And so when Hereford breeders chose to move the cloud, they now had the opportunity to put more emphasis on improving the carcass merit and less emphasis on growth. And we can see that here as a bend in that curve for growth rate. So here is the same data for the American Angus Association. And you'll see one of the things that is either very good or very bad is the fact that you actually haven't seemed to have changed your attitude about growth from 1980 through to 2015. So this is based on the American Angus Association genetic trend estimates. I got these off the website at the airport yesterday, so these are the most up-to-date ones. They only go up to 2017 birth year. But selection for growth, we just heard about discussion about carcasses getting bigger. And the size of those carcasses is not being driven by the abattoir end or the processor end. It's being driven way back in the bull selection things that happened a couple of generations before those animals were born. So that's what happened. Yearling weight going up, weaning weight going up, carcass weight going up. So the American Angus Association tries to combine all of that into a dollar value, the dollar beef, which is saying something about how valuable that particular individual is. And here are the trends, again, straight off their website from yesterday, of the dollar beef trend going back since 1980. And so it started off back there at almost $30, and now it's at about $130. It's gone up by $103 per head. So we can really pat you on the back, or pat those farmers on the back who did these selections, to show that they have made tremendous improvements at improving the profitability of those steers that go through, say, a feedlot system, both in terms of the cost of production, in terms of the value of the material they are selling. It's much, much better. That's what I would call a terminal trait. So fantastic performance on that terminal trait. Oops. But they also show some information on genetic trend on the costs of running a female. So it's very easy to get excited about these 400-gram steaks and that restaurant. I'm sorry, I've already forgotten what road it was on. But we do have to remember about these cows. These cows running up on those hills of Victoria or anywhere else, they're eating food. And the more they eat, the less of those cows you can run on that country. And so the cow-calf producer has some cost aspects, not just the aspects about the product that's generated. So this is what they call their dollar energy savings. So their dollar energy savings has got worse. So that means the cost of feeding the average daughter compared to the 1981 is about $57 more feed per year, according to their website. So the average daughter eats $57 more feed per year, has heavier live weights, about 3 kilos of birth weight, 57 kilos weaning weight, 104 kilos yearling weight, and according to their website, only 35 kilograms of mature weight. I find that very hard to believe. When I was a student, an Angus cow post-calving was ideally under 400 kilos. And I would say the genetic trend for mature weight is between 3 and 5 kilos of mature weight per year every year for the last 30 years, which makes them 100 to 150 kilos heavier in mature weight now than they were when I was a student in the late 1970s. They also have higher milk production, equivalent to about 16 kilos of weaning weight. And one of the things about higher milk production is it means the animals have higher maintenance requirements even when they're not lactating. And if you are not familiar with that, you only need to go and buy some dairy animals and run them with your beef animals at the same time, and you'll be able to see those differences. And all of those costs are carried by the cow-calf operator. Now, the feedlot offspring do earn more, but unfortunately, every cow doesn't produce a feedlot offspring every year, and at least some of the benefit is captured by the feedlot or by the processor. So collectively, I would say the cow-calf operator, the genetic change that has occurred since 1980 has not been what I would consider to be improvement. So the cloud has moved, it's moved hugely, but it's moved more in a terminal side direction and not enough in a maternal cow direction. So how do you, as bull breeders, carry out these exercises? Will you measure things like calving ease and birth weight, early growth traits, weaning weight and yearling weight, and to a lesser extent reproduction, and to a lesser extent ultrasound or cow weights and condition scores of mature cows, carcass characteristics or feeding intake? So we have decreasing number of records as we come down those lists. And principally the things that you measure are the things that are tangible. They're easy to measure, they're heritable, they're easy to see them change. You can see what's happening in the next generation. And what we do is we measure them, or you measure them, you store them on database systems through your breed associations, you evaluate them using systems like BreedPlan, you report them, and then you market the predictions of those animals on that basis. And what you have done is just whatever was done by your fathers or your father's fathers, or what made sense to you, and you've made incremental change from that. But if you were asking somebody like myself as a professional animal breeder, how would I design a breeding program for you? Then I would start with a blank piece of paper and I would go through a logical process. So if somebody like the Gates Foundation asks me to come and look at their rice breeding program, I have a recipe I follow to look at whether they are doing a good job or a bad job. And we use this kind of recipe in all kinds of industries that I've had the pleasure of working with over the years. And the first thing we need to think about is, what is the goal of your breeding program? What is it you want to achieve? And if you can't tell me what your goal is, then we actually have a problem right from the start. So hopefully, if I bump into any of you in the elevator tomorrow or at afternoon tea or somebody else, you'll be able to tell me straight away what your goal is in simple terms, something that only lasts as long as it takes the elevator to go from one floor to the next, what you want to achieve. And this is something you should have as a nation, your beef industry. It's something you should have as a breed association. It's something you should have as a bull breeder. This is a company that I've done a lot of work over the years, Livestock Improvement Corporation. It's a breeding organisation and herd testing organisation in dairy cattle in New Zealand. And some years ago, they had this little advertising expression: if you're not farming for profit, we'd like to wish you well with your hobby. So they define their goal as profit. Originally, it was thought of as profit per hectare, but it's actually profit per 4.5 tonnes of dry matter. Why 4.5 tonnes of dry matter? That's the average amount of dry matter a dairy cow in New Zealand, averaged across breed and her share of replacements, eats in a year. So they recognise we're in a pastoral production system, and some cows are bigger and eat more and some are smaller and eat less, but the goal is profit per unit of food consumed. The next step, once you have your goal, and we can't really consider this without a goal, is what do you want to change that will advance your animals towards that goal? And that involves two things: a list of the traits that you want to change, those are the EBVs that you will need, and those define the axes that we're interested in, that cloud that describes your selection candidates. And then we need to know the relative emphasis of each of those traits, and that defines the index we would use to summarise the merit of the animals in those clouds. Once we know the list of traits we want EBVs for, we then ask, what do we need to measure on the individuals to produce those EBVs? And then we ask, who are we going to measure to produce the EBVs? Are we going to measure the individuals? Are we going to measure their brothers or their sisters or their offspring? Are we going to slaughter some of them? Are we going to generate progeny to get EBVs on the parents? That's all aspects of breeding scheme design. Then we have to think about the dissemination systems. What are we going to do with the good ones? Are we going to clone them? Are we going to sell semen via AI? Are we going to sell sexed semen? Are we going to sell just natural mating bulls? And how are we going to mate them? Are we going to mate them at random? Are we going to use some kind of mating plan like mating relatives to each other, which would be known as inbreeding, or are we going to do outcrossing and mate individuals to less related individuals? So in the US, for instance, because of some of the trends I've shown you in the past, a common mating plan at the moment is to mate Hereford bulls to Angus cows, because of the fact that the Angus Association hasn't done enough emphasis on those maternal traits in the view of many of the commercial calf operators. And that's why the Hereford Association has seen such a success in bull sales in recent times in the US. Then we need to do an economic analysis and say, what are the overall benefits and their overall costs? I could easily double the rate of improvement in any industry I've ever had anything to do with. But in many cases, the cost of implementing those improvements would be more than the benefits that flow right through the system. So in my job, and probably in your jobs as well, it's actually all about compromise. It's about compromise and only spending the money where we know that we get a good return on that investment. And related to that is the fact that we need to think about who the beneficiaries are and who's going to pay for it. I can almost always demonstrate at a national or a global level that if we invest in a breeding program, it will do really, really good value for everybody in the system. The trouble is the people that incur the costs, the people that do the measurement or the recording or the valuation and the selection, are not the same as the people who benefit from the improvement. Ultimately, it's the customer, the end customer, the consumer, the person that eats the steak, say, that benefits from most of the improvement. And the important thing for you is to pass that price signal for good individuals all the way back through the chain. And a sad thing that I heard in the talk immediately before mine was there was no profit in your steaks, right? The profit was made from the wine. We actually want profit to be made from the steaks, so a price signal, more is paid for the better stuff, so it flows all the way back through the producer to demand more for the purchase of sires that generate more profitable offspring, and that sends a signal back to the bull breeder to go more and more into moving the cloud in that particular direction that's driven by the marketplace. But commonly in improvement industries, we have market failure at this stage. Okay, so if I asked you to give me your goal, you'll probably struggle with that. But if I asked you to list the traits that you think you want to change, you probably do that very easily. And you'd probably come up with 20, 30, 40, 50 different things you might want to change. And generally speaking, I could classify them into these kind of groups. There'd be things associated with reproduction and longevity. And I would include in those things like jaws and feet and so There's traits that affect income over feed costs, so things about growth, things about eating quality, things about maternal, terminal and replacement feed costs. There'll be aspects to do with the welfare of the animal, so these would be some things like diseases and docility and so on. And there'll be things that affect the environmental hoofprint of the individuals. And generally, when you think about measuring an improvement for these things, you'll focus on the tangible ones that's easy for you to see, and the things that kind of poke you in the eye every day or every month when you're running your operations. And you probably don't think so much about these ones, which have become a lot more important in recent days because of social media. And it only takes one little Facebook post for suddenly some of these issues to become much more important. I also heard about, an animal in the last talk putting its feet into the water to cool them down. That would be a really negative thing in New Zealand, to think that a cow had access to a river to be able to stand in the water. Might cool its feet down, but it washes some other things down the river, which the consumers don't want to know about, don't want to have happen. So what are the jobs, what are the traits you're doing a good job of selecting? You're doing a good job of selecting for the income traits, particularly growth, and some of the things that affect eating quality. And again, we just heard that it's actually pretty easy to improve eating quality if you want to age the animals for a period, like age the carcass for something like 8 weeks. But an awful lot of meat in the world gets consumed just within 2 or 3 days of the time it's harvested. And so that's why some of the traits that we need to select for wouldn't actually make much difference to the eating quality after 8 weeks, but they might make a big difference to the eating quality after just a few days of aging. What are the things you could do a better job of selecting on? Well, I would argue it's basically everything else. Basically everything else. Okay, so why aren't these other traits being adequately considered? Well, I think part of the problem is that you are not selecting on the total merit indexes. You might say you are, but when we look in the rear vision mirror, we don't see very good indication of that. When we look back at your genetic trends, what we would expect to see is an inflection occurring in your trends when new indexes were developed. Now, most of the time, if the index is good, you should have been improving it anyway because you were selecting for some of the components on it. But if you really started selecting on the index, we should see a faster rate of progress in the index and perhaps a lesser response in some of the easy traits to select and an improved response in some of the more difficult traits to select. And in particular, the one that tends to get missed out a lot is the maternal system traits. You're not measuring enough of the less tangible attributes, things that can't be measured in a production setting. So, for instance, the carcass merit on a breeding animal, not easy to measure that. You approximate it sometimes with an ultrasound scan or by visual assessment of the live animal. Things that are hard to measure in a production setting, so things like intermittent disease, or you might manage them in such a way that your animals don't get exposed to those diseases, which is great from a production setting point of view, but it's not very good if you're trying to make genetic improvement. You need to challenge those animals, and in New Zealand we have a big problem with a disease called facial eczema. And no breeder would really want to challenge their animals for facial eczema, but we know it's quite a heritable trait and we could make good response to selection. Some of the things are too expensive or too labour intensive to measure, things like age at puberty as an example, but maybe there are new devices, things like Internet of Things or wearable devices that will give us new data on those. Or some of you don't see a demand for them because the person who turns up at your property to buy your bulls doesn't ask you about them. And they maybe don't even look at your catalogue, they just look at the bulls in the yard and choose the ones they like. Or maybe you don't believe in them, you don't see some of these things as important. Or maybe you don't see the value proposition, you don't see that this investment is going to give you a return. But you are prepared to invest in testing for things like genetic defects, and when some of these new genetic disorders have been identified, there's been millions of dollars invested by the Angus Association in the US as an example to get rid of some genetic defect, or hundreds of thousands of SNP chip genotypes for genomic prediction. So we know people are prepared to invest if they see the value proposition. So maybe a lot of the problem is they're not seeing the value proposition, perhaps because of market failure in the way that the animals are sold all the way down the chain before they end up in the restaurant. So if you asked me about the value proposition among the bull breeding sector, I would say the big problem with beef industries globally is there are too many animals being recorded. Too many animals being recorded and not enough traits being recorded. If we were to compare the beef industry to, say, the chicken industry or the pork industry or the maize industry, what you would see is much more extensive phenotyping on much smaller populations. The nucleus populations in chicken and pig breeding operations that provide the germplasm for the world are based on herds of over only a few thousand individuals, where we have tens of thousands of individuals being measured in the nucleus herds in the beef sector, but most of them are just being measured for things like birth weight, weaning weight, yearling weight, and an ultrasound scan or two. Not being rewarded by bull buyers in terms of price or demand, particularly for less tangible traits. Bull buyers tend to like buying the things they can see on the animals in front of them, and they can't see things like feedlot performance, feed efficiency. They can't see some of the carcass things. The breed association structure might even be impeding innovation. And if we look back 20 or 30 years ago, some of the breed associations have really been amazingly good at encouraging performance recording and evaluation and driving improvement. But some of those business models have changed a little bit, and they've particularly changed with the introduction of genomics. So an example for this is where in the US in particular, some individual breeders have been interested in investing in grow-safe system. And a grow-safe system is something that allows you to tell how much an animal is eating, so you can select for feed efficiency. So you can get a few breeders who decide, that's great, I'm going to invest a whole lot of money in a grow-safe system, I'm going to measure feed intake, and I'm going to have EBVs for feed intake or feed efficiency, and that's going to make me different from everybody else, right? Well, unfortunately, if you're part of the breed association, their feed intake, it goes through the breed association analysis. It gets used in genomic prediction like single step, and everybody else in the whole industry suddenly gets an EBV for feed intake, even though they didn't invest a cent in the grow-safe system or the testing of the animals that that particular individual breeder did. And so because of that, there are actually some groups of bull breeders who are seriously considering breaking out of that breed association structure and forming their own independent structures with their own independent evaluations so they can get benefit from being innovative that is being averaged out and washed away by being part of some of the bigger structures. How might more balanced selection occur? Well, new technologies for measuring will be important. Subsidies by government or levy players may be important. Local regulations, so in places like New Zealand, things like nutrient excretion limits. So we have regulations about, say, urea output in the urine of animals that affect what you're allowed to do. Market requirements is another one, specifications for access to markets, especially export markets. In some European countries now, the proportion of calves that are born that are polled has been increasing exponentially from year to year, and it's highly likely in the relatively near future that some dairy markets will not allow dairy products to be produced from animals that are genetically horned, because they have to be dehorned in ways that social media indicates is not appropriate. And so some countries like, say, Austria and Switzerland are increasing the selection for polled cattle so that they can show that they don't have to go through those practices. New business structures to capture value is the other thing. Small collectives or vertical integration. I know some of that is going on again here in Australia. Traits we could do a better job of selecting, so reproduction, longevity, tenderness, health, healthfulness, feed, animal welfare, and environmental hoofprint. So you might say, well, you know, I've painted a negative picture. I've made too much of a fuss about this. So I'm not sure that that's my view on it. Reproduction and longevity traits. Currently, you make some use of calving records, for instance, sustained fertility. You make little use of heifer pregnancy data. Generally, you only record things on selected replacements, and the recorded traits tend to have low heritability and are measured later in life. You make inadequate use of puberty data, you make inadequate use of postpartum and estrus interval, you make inadequate use of conception information, and you're maybe not using some of these new traits. The one that in reproduction has come out recently looking quite promising is the anogenital distance, which in some of our New Zealand data looks like it could be a pretty good predictor of performance. In terms of feed intake, forage intake would be nice to get more measurement on, which requires behavioural aspects, grazing times, walking distance, forward selection. Feedlot intake, it's a complex trait. It's not easy to measure. You can do it with things like GrowSafe, but we find the genes involved in the efficiency are not the same in bulls as they are in heifers. They're not the same in stage of life, so they're not the same immediately post-weaning as they are immediately pre-harvest, and they're not the same when you change the diet between growing and finishing. So you can't easily have one EBV for feed efficiency that will be appropriate for all those sexes and stages of life and diets. So in the social media and online, there are lots of sources now to show you some of the statistics about what's going on in the world, and I'll draw your attention to this one, Our World in Data. And this has a lot of information on that website about many aspects of the planet. But these are some of the things that are a little bit disturbing from a beef point of view. If you want to just sit back and continue moving the cloud in a terminal side direction and not take on board some of the concepts that I've just promoted. So the feed required to produce 1 kilogram of meat or dairy product, this might be something that a consumer looks at when they make a purchase decision about what they're going to eat. Here, coming from the most efficient, whole milk, then there's eggs, poultry, pork, lamb, and beef. So lamb is 15 kilos of feed per unit of meat. Beef is 25 kilos of feed. Now, you and I know that a lot of those beef animals are eating feed that nothing else would eat. They're eating it on hills, they're eating it in other places, and they're doing environmental benefit in those places. But it doesn't change the fact that to many people they would just see this feed per unit of meat being worse for beef than it is for anything else. Energy efficiency of meat and dairy production, so another kind of a measure. So again, whole milk, eggs, poultry, pork, lamb, there is beef. 1.9% energy efficiency. So the energy that is in the beef relative to the energy that it takes to produce it, it's only harvesting less than 2% of it. Here is the same thing on protein efficiency rather than energy efficiency, and again the same story, beef sitting right down there at the 3.8%. Remember, I told you we can move the cloud in any way you like. So if you wanted to make your goal to improve the protein efficiency of beef production, we could make huge improvements in this particular characteristic. But that's not what you're going to achieve by accident by selecting on things like yearling weight. Animal welfare, disease resistance, a whole bunch of traits there, resistance to the environment, horn-polled temperament, environmental hoof print, urinary nitrogen excretion, incredibly important in the New Zealand industry at the moment. Greenhouse gases, another one we hear a lot about, and the other one, soil damage and sediment loss. This is becoming quite a big one. A lot of sediment going down catchments when they put weir systems into rivers. They find a lot of sediment coming off forested land, but also coming off pasture and cropland, and a lot of it comes down increased levels of it come down when you have poor management factors, particularly associated with the way you might winter cattle. So again, looking at greenhouse gases per unit of protein on that website, and there we got beef and mutton sitting way, way, way up there, much, much higher than pork, poultry, eggs and fresh produce and pretty much everything else. If we look at what is happening in meat production in the world, again from the data on those same kind of websites, huge growth in the production of poultry. So here I have a 50-year time frame. So when I was born, a little bit before the beginning of this here, we only ever had chicken on special occasions. We ate lamb and beef every day, and we're never sorry to do it. Here again we see the big growth in pork. Beef isn't growing so much, it's grown a little bit but not nearly as much, and all the other things don't really count. Most of the growth is occurring in pork and poultry. When we look at per capita meat consumption, obviously that beef and that poultry and pork has got to be going somewhere, so huge increases in the amount of poultry that has been consumed. So whereas when I was growing up we had chicken on a birthday or on Christmas, it's now turned around the other way where maybe people have lamb or beef on birthday or Christmas, but they have poultry maybe 4 or 5 times a week. And I was pretty horrified when I came back to New Zealand 2 years ago and looked at the New Zealand statistics. This is just over the 10-year period from 2006-7 to 2016-17. That should be over 10 years. This is the carcass weight equivalent production consumption for an average Kiwi of beef, of sheep, of pork, of poultry and total. So in total we really haven't changed. We're still eating the same 95 odd kilos carcass equivalent, but our sheep and beef has gone down about 40%, and some of that is associated with the fact that the price of those has gone up, whereas the price of these other ones is lower and has stayed the same. And why has it stayed the same? Because they've had really good selection programs that have been focused at moving the cloud to make the performance of those pig and poultry systems as cost effective as they possibly can. And one of the reasons that we haven't been able to achieve the same things here is we've been focusing too much on those terminal sire characteristics and not enough on the whole systems aspects. So moving the cloud, doing a good job on growth, you could do a better job on a whole many of those other things. So in summary, we really need to improve the efficiency of beef production. We need to be seen to be trying to improve the efficiency of beef production, and particularly that means reproductive efficiency, birth to finish efficiency, and doing so involves a number of traits, many not adequately considered. Selection is a proven and cost-effective mechanism for doing this, but it needs to be based on whole system indexes. Whole system indexes, not just, say, a feedlot index. It needs to comprise EVVs for economically relevant traits based on sensible phenotyping strategies combined with the use of genomics. Genomics allows us to get predictions of these things in all kinds of ways we couldn't do in the past, but we need to do it in a way that doesn't give us market failure and that rewards the individuals that invest in those new activities. And if we're going to do this, it's not going to be led by people like me who talk about it. It's going to be led by people like you who do it. It needs to be led by innovative breeders, and it needs to be led by those among you that are entrepreneurs who can see business opportunities for these kind of things. Thanks very much.
So once again, we have a couple of roving microphones. We've got a couple of minutes for a few quick questions if somebody's got one.
Dorian, could you just mention the stayability index in the US, and if that is doing the job of allowing to select on maternal traits, and possibly if there's an opportunity for that to help us on maternal traits in Australia?
Yeah, so US performance recording systems in the past were probably one of the world's worst practices. When I was a PhD student at Cornell and got access to all the Simmental data, I was amazed to discover that there was huge variation in the sex ratio of offspring of bulls. There were some bulls that had only 10% of their offspring were males, and there were other bulls where 50% of their offspring were males. And I thought, how could this possibly be? Well, it's because they didn't in those days have total herd reporting. So when you had a calf on the ground, you had to pay to get it registered. And if you chose not to pay to get it registered, then the data never went into the system. So they had very, very poor systems for recording things like reproductive success. Stayability was just our attempt as scientists to try and come up with a prediction for reproductive traits when the breeders and the breed associations wouldn't change their business models to make total herd reporting mandatory. So the stayability evaluation was just determining whether a cow stayed in the herd. And originally when we implemented it, it was just done by seeing that at some point in her life, at an old age, she had a calf. So even though we didn't have records necessarily of what had happened every year in between, she might have calved as a 2-year-old and calved another time as a 6-year-old, then we said she stayed in the herd. But we really didn't know if she'd calved again at 3 and at 4 and at 5. So initially it was a pretty blunt instrument. And when it was applied to some breeds like Simmental, and we discovered genomics and we ran genome analyses, we'd have found a really incredible gene that affected stayability in Simmental cattle. And it was associated with pigmentation. If they produced offspring that were black, then they stayed in the herd a lot more because of the way the CAB system worked. But since that time, most US associations have developed total herd reporting, and so stayability is just a prediction really of sustained fertility, where we're trying to identify animals that are recording that are repeating performance every year. You try and do it in Australia with a thing called days to calving. And the trouble I have about days to calving is if somebody tells me days to calving is -2 days, I'm just a farmer. I'm busy trying to grow grass and feed animals. I don't understand what -2 days to calving means. I understand how many calves I get per 100 cows mated or something. It's not a statistic that I find helps me very well. So yes, stayability is an approach. It's not the best approach. It's what we've done, limited by the data that we've been able to deal with, and it's something that the industry has adopted and has liked to use and include in their indexes.
Might have another question over here.
Is this on?
Yep.
If everyone continues to chase the cloud in the same direction, aren't you reducing the genetic pool to a big extent? And aren't there gains to be made from like joining animals from different ends of the pool?
Exactly. You're exactly right. And if you were to look at how the pig industry or the poultry industry or the maize industry does it, they don't have one thing like Angus. If the Angus Association was run by the pig or poultry industry, they would probably have something like 10 lines of cattle. And each line of cattle would never be bred to cattle from any of the other lines. So it'd be like 10 different new breeds. And each breed would be moving the cloud in a different direction. So one of them might be focused more on terminal traits, one of them might be focused more on maternal traits, one of them might be focused more on disease aspects that are peculiar to certain environments. And then what they would do is they would cross individuals between those lines to generate the commercial individuals. So if, heaven forbid, you ever eat a bit of chicken or you have an egg, it's a 4-way cross. So that poultry you consume is a 4-way cross. So its grandparents come from 4 different breeding lines that were changing the cloud in 4 different directions. And it concerns me greatly that That's not what tends to happen in the beef industry. Everybody chases the same kind of fashion. Everybody chases the same fashionables. And you saw the trends from the American Angus Association. Everybody is pushing the cloud in that same direction. And just year after year after year for the last 40 years, it goes up exactly in that same direction at the same rate it was moving in the past. And what I like is about industries like, say, the sheep industry, where each breeder almost runs their own breeding program. And breeders have different views about how important fibre fineness will be, or say how important omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acid composition might be, or how important foot rot might be. We want different breeders doing different things, so then collectively the commercial sector has the opportunity to mix and match between those breeding programs.
How do we change that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not me. I rank animals, but I'm not the one that chooses which one gets to be a father or which one gets to be a mother, right? Now, in some countries, like in the EU, there's laws about it. You can't just keep a bull calf because you like him and use it. Or you can't keep a stallion because you think it's a nice-looking stallion and use him as a father. There are laws, they have to go through performance tests and they have to be in the top performing individuals and so on before you're allowed to use them as a parent. This country, you can do what you like. And so what we're seeing is the effects of you guys doing what you like. So you guys need to change your practice. And I know that's like rounding up cats. Most of you are not. You're going to do, you know, what you like doing and what you have been doing. But we just need a few of you to do it, right? But you are the ones that make those decisions. Brad.
Thanks, Dorian. We better wrap it up there. I'm conscious of running over time. Thank you very much.